Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm going to be looking at how much better Loki's two new uniforms make him and which of the two could possibly be the best. I doubt that one of the uniforms will clearly outperform the other, so I did a lot of testing and it should give you a better idea of which uniform is better for what mode. The initial assumption is that the President Loki uniform will outperform the TVA one because it has more effects on the skills. But as you may know from other patches, or maybe not, the patch notes don't detail everything. So things like iframes, hit count, and the raw damage of a skill isn't included, as well as additional effects like super guard break. But if you recall from other patch notes, or maybe not everything is detailed in the patch notes. So things like if the skill is an iframe, the number of hits it has, and how much raw damage the skill has isn't usually listed, as well as other additional effects like super guard break. So basically you can't really tell if a uniform will be good or not unless it's tested, which is what I'm doing. Since the last update, I've gained 2% concentration on my cards, as well as I believe 6% pierce. So just keep in mind that all the testing is done with stats like these. Since most people are familiar with what Loki can do, I decided to forego testing the World Boss Ultimate stages and went straight for World Boss Legend Null, so I could get a base result to compare to the newer uniforms. The current build that I'm using on Loki is a CTP of Rage, and I'm not too sure if people use a single skill damage proc on him, such as an energy, but I think because he has so many different skills that he can spam, that a Rage probably and most likely is the best. At least for PvE. Anyways, with this previous uniform, the fastest that I completed the stage was with 2 minutes and 48 seconds remaining. The first of the two new uniforms that I tested out was the President one. The rotation for this new uniform is a little bit different than the old one, so I believe the go-to rotation for the old one was 4, cancel 5, cancel 3, and then you'd use your 2 and 1 as filler. You would do this because the 4th would provide you a damage buff to all skills, the 5 would provide a damage buff to your next 2 skills. You would then use the 3rd skill to get back closer to the enemy, since the 4 and 5 kind of put you a little bit out of range. For this one, the rotation is 3, cancel 5, cancel 4, because you can't instantly cancel your 4 to have the damage persist. You have to stay in it this time. If you want to, you could also quickly spam your 1 and 2 before going into that rotation, so you can fill up your ult a little bit faster. But for the most part, you're going to be insta canceling the 2 and 1 just to fill up your ultimate meter, or using it when your other skills are down to get that damage in the meantime and also fill up the meter. When you have your ultimate, the rotation would be almost the same, except you would do 3, cancel 5, cancel ultimate, and then cancel into your 4th skill. Anyways, you can see the President uniform does give him a pretty decent buff, since he completes the content with 3 minutes and 29 seconds remaining, which is 43 seconds faster than his old uniform. Looking at the TVA uniform, the rotation is exactly the same as the President Loki uniform. By the way, I have to say, the way that they incorporated the show's visuals into these uniforms is pretty amazing. The portals opening up and Loki attacking, as well as the 3rd skill having that timeline branching and showing the Nexus events, is really cool. Even though the skill rotations are the same, some of the key differences between the two uniforms is that the President Loki uniform's 2nd skill has mind control, paralysis, and invincible on it, whereas the TVA one does not. Besides this, the President Loki uniform's 4th skill removes the active buff from target, has silence and mind control added to it, in addition to 5 extra damage to the buff that affects all skills. And probably the most significant difference between the two uniforms is on their tier 1 passive, and for the TVA uniform, it's listed that he gets 25% guaranteed crit rate. As for the President Loki uniform, he instead gets 50% damage mitigation and 15% heal when the Dominance of Spirit effect is used by him. If you're wondering what that means, it basically means that when you use your second or your fourth skill that has mind control, he will get that passive effect activated. I'm not sure why it says dominance of spirit when it can just say when mind control is used, but yeah, they need to kind of clean up their battle terms a little bit. But yeah, anyways, with the TVA uniform, I finished 11 seconds faster than the President Loki uniform. I found that result a little bit surprising since, like everyone else, I kind of assumed that the President Loki uniform would outperform the TVA one. Keeping that in mind, one test doesn't outright prove that the TVA uniform's damage is better than the President Loki uniform, so I have to look at other game modes that can measure the damage output. I could have also raised the stage to a higher level, but there's restrictions on the higher ones that I wanted to test on, and the reason that I'm doing another test is because if the fight is a little bit too quick, it might not be as conclusive, which might have been the case for the last one. As you can see, the mode that I'm using to gauge that damage increase is Alliance Battle Extreme, and before I see how much better the two new uniforms are between one another, I wanted to get an idea of how much better they are compared to the old one. With the old uniform, I scored around the 7.8 million mark, and I could probably push that to around the 8 million to 8.2 million mark if I got a really good rotation in. After a few tries with the President Loki uniform, the highest that I managed was around 8.6 million, which is 800,000 more than the old uniform. I'd like to add that this uniform is easier to use in ABX for Silence Season since this one has silence on the fourth skill, whereas the old uniform and the TVA uniform have silence only on the ultimate. Regardless of this, when I tested the TVA uniform, I was able to push into the 9.1 million mark, which I wasn't really able to get close to with the President Loki uniform. My guess is that this is largely due to the fact that the passive on the TVA uniform gives him that guaranteed crit rate. The reason that that's so significant is because I have a CTP of Rage, and because that guaranteed crit rate is there, that means that the Rage will more reliably activate the proc effect. Not only that, but more of the hits will be crits and make use of the high crit damage that I have. It would be interesting to note how the two uniforms compare when energy is used instead, but that's not the test that I did here since my build is with the Rage. I don't believe the guaranteed crit is the only factor since the hit count and the raw damage that the two different uniforms have is also a factor. You can see the comparison of the hit count here, where his first skill on the Loki uniform does 12 hits, and on the second skill it does 9 hits. On the TVA uniform, even though the first skill does the same number of hits, the second one does 16 hits, which is 7 more than the President Loki uniform. The third skill for both uniforms does the same number of hits, but for the President Loki uniform, the fourth skill does 30 hits, and for the TVA uniform, the same skill does 35 hits, though I've seen it go up to 36 as well. Taking into consideration these number of hits, and to make sure that my results were accurate, I also decided to take Loki into the no restrictions for squad battle to see how he stacked up there as well. With the old uniform, I scored in the 7.7 million range. With the President Loki uniform, I was able to reach the 8.9 million range, which was 1.2 million more than the last uniform. Lastly, with the TVA uniform, and now unsurprisingly, I scored 2 million points more roughly and reached the 9.1 million mark. I almost got to the 9.2 million mark, which is about 2 to 3 million more than the President Loki uniform, so you can see that there's a clear difference in damage between the two uniforms, specifically when a Rage build is involved anyway. Damage isn't the only thing to consider with these uniforms though, it's also how the skills themselves work. One of the other things that I was testing was what kind of effect the skills have on the characters. You can see for the President Loki uniform that the enemies largely stay grouped together. With the TVA uniform, that's not exactly the same case. Although the first and the second skill largely keep the enemies together, the fourth skill moves the character around a lot, as well as the enemies, and can split them up. The President Loki uniform, on the other hand's fourth skill actually pulled enemies together. If you're wondering why this is significant, it can make a pretty big deal in dispatch modes, especially on high levels, where there are a lot of enemies and they don't die very quickly, so if they get split apart, then it can lead to a fail. The dispatch test that I did here with the old uniform was to see what the fastest time I could complete it with was. On auto, this came out to exactly 60 seconds, and then with the TVA uniform, this came out to 59 seconds, which is just 1 second short of the last result. You could be wondering how that is, since the uniforms clearly perform better in the other stuff that I tested, but on auto, it's all about consistency, and for this uniform, the worst time that I finished with was the 59 seconds. You can see that for the old uniform, the worst time that I was able to complete it with was 47 seconds, and the best time was actually the 60 seconds. With the President Loki uniform, the worst time that I finished with was the 60 seconds, and largely, for the most part, the testing that I did in dispatch, the President Loki uniform turned out to be the most consistent with the finish times. Even still, you might be thinking that getting a lower damage uniform just for dispatch when it's such a close time between one another is kind of silly. Then yeah, it kind of is. So then the only other factor would be if one of the uniforms performs better in PvP than the other, because clearly the TVA uniform seems to be better for PvE. Unfortunately, it's a little bit tough for me to say if one of the uniforms is better than the other in PvP, since that requires a lot of testing and I can't do that on such a short time frame. Besides that, the CTP that I have equipped is a CTP of Rage, so that by default isn't good for testing and won't really give the best results. That said, from the testing that I did, I have to say that both of these uniforms are better than the previous uniform, since the third skill, providing immunity to damage, adds a lot of survival to his kit that he previously didn't have. In addition to this, the multiple tests that I did with Rage, I found out that the TVA uniform seemed to win more often, mostly due to the fact that he had a long iframe on his second skill on that uniform and he doesn't on the President Loki uniform. On the President Loki uniform, he has Invincible instead, but I find that that isn't really as good, since a lot of characters can cast even if he is invincible, and if they have penetration, they can just go through it. And especially in Alliance Conquest, that can cause the opponent to activate skills on the character that isn't in iframe, which can splash onto other teammates. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that the President Loki uniform is worse for PvP, because he does have a lot of extra healing and CC effects. I wouldn't be surprised if the President Loki uniform performed better in PvP overall if you had a survival based build on him, such as a CTP of Authority and possibly even a regen. He does have a lot of healing on that uniform, and for both uniforms the damage increase is pretty substantial, so you don't necessarily need a damage proc for them. That said, I was kind of surprised that Loki with either of the uniforms could take out all of the opponents like he did. This leads me to believe that even though he doesn't have penetration in his kit, he does have a lot of lingering effects, which lend really well to something like a CTP of Greed. So if you wanted to go with a hybrid build, then a Greed might actually be a really good choice, because if you do use him in dispatch as well, he'll get that ignore dodge, which will help him out a lot. That pretty much wraps up my testing. If you can only get one of these uniforms and you ask me which one to get, I would probably say go with the TVA one. Due to my build and because Alliance Conquest isn't currently active, I can't necessarily recommend the President Loki uniform yet, but if I was able to make the TVA uniform work in the timeline tests that I did, I can't really see the President Loki uniform being greatly better than that one for PvP purposes at the very least. I don't want to speak too early on the PvP potential, but that's kind of the first impressions I had on that from the testing I did. I'm working on a quick War Machine video that should be out early tomorrow, so if you're interested to see how much better he gets in PvE and how he fares in PvP, then make sure to check that out. As always, if you liked the video, then consider liking and subscribing, and if you have any questions, include them in the comments and I'll answer them as soon as I can. Thanks for your time and watching, but the video is now over.